Joining us now, the man George Bush called the architect of his back-to-back wins in the White House, 8 years there. Political guru, as we said, Fox News contributor Karl Rove joining us this morning. Good morning, Karl.
Good morning, Diane. How are you?
Let's start with this topic of the morning for us. Is there a rebellion brewing in this country about the compensation on Wall Street while Main Street is suffering, and what should be done about it? Should there be some curve put on the amount of profits and bonuses being taken on Wall Street by banks that were bailed out by the taxpayer?
Look, I think what we really ought to be focused on is getting the government out of the bank's business and the banks out of the taxpayer's pocket. Remember, this was done with great reluctance by the previous administration. We were at a point last fall, about a year ago, where literally the credit system of the United States was on the verge of going down. And if it had happened, the economic ripples throughout the country would have been enormous. People would have lost their jobs, small businesses shuttered, the economy shut down. So an emergency, presented a challenge to how to save the banks. And having done it, having stabilized the banks, now maybe we ought to be thinking about getting the banks out of the taxpayers' pocket.
Well, but Karl, everyone can wish for a better economy and getting the banks and the government decoupled here. But this is a reality right now for the American taxpayer. What do you say to them should be done about these bonuses? Is it fair? And populism, as you know, is the driving fuel of American politics. What do you say to them? What should be done?
Look, what ought to be done is the banks ought to get their hands out of the taxpayer's pocket, and the government ought to get out of their business. I mean, we have...
So nothing should be done in terms of compensation and bonuses?
Well, let me finish. I've talked to a number of bankers, particularly regional bankers, who accepted government money or had it forced on them and want to give it back. And we ought to make it easier for them to do that, not harder. Every bit of evidence we have is that the banks are stabilized. Let's get the money back so that the taxpayer gets their money back and the banks get the freedom to do what they want to do within, sort of the regulatory framework we have. But I get very nervous when the government starts determining what is an appropriate salary and not an appropriate salary. I mean, it's a very dangerous road once we go down there. It makes it more likely that the government stays involved with an enterprise when it gets to regulate it in the kind of day-to-day fashion that we're talking about with the banks.
So let it go for now?
No, let's focus on getting the banks out of the taxpayer's pocket and the government out of the bank's business. That's what we ought to be focused on.
I want to turn to another big topic on the table at the White House, of course, Afghanistan, and will there be a change in strategy there? George Will, as you know, a member of your team, has said 40,000 troop increase will not be enough and that they should concentrate instead on other approaches, that additional troops will not be enough and will not work. If you were advising the president this morning, what would you tell him?
I'd be saying pay very close attention to the people that you have put in command of the operation in Afghanistan. Listen closely to what they have to say about what they think they need in order to achieve the mission that you defined for them, Mr. President, in March of this year. President Obama made a very tough speech in March in which he outlines the consequences to our country and to the world if Afghanistan returned to the way it was in the 1990s, a failed state. So I'd say give the commanders on the ground your closest attention, ask them tough questions, ask them to explain their positions, but listen carefully to what they suggest needs to be done in order to achieve the goals that you outlined in March.
Well, speaking of those commanders, Admiral McMullen, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and also General Stanley McChrystal, who is head of the operation in Afghanistan, have both said that the reason we're in the situation we're in right now is that this war was under-resourced, including during the Bush administration years. Let me play what they've said first.
It's been 8 years. Why isn't it better? We've under-resourced our operations.
This has been a mission that has not been well-resourced. It's been under-resourced almost since its inception, certainly in recent years. And part of why it has gotten more serious and has deteriorated has been directly tied to that.
Did the Bush administration drop the ball on resourcing the war in Afghanistan?
Well, I think we got to look at it in a more sophisticated way. I think that these answers become clear in retrospect. I don't believe that at the time the military was saying we are doing we need significantly more. If there had been that cry, I suspect the previous administration would have been very responsive to it. There was a concern about were our NATO partners meeting their responsibility. We had described a certain level of activity that we wanted NATO and the United States together, our coalition partners, to meet, and we felt in the previous administration that our coalition partners were not meeting their responsibilities. It's an attitude shared by the current administration, which, as you remember, went to NATO earlier this year. President Obama did, and asked for additional resources and was rebuffed. It's one of the reasons why the Bush administration added additional resources to Afghanistan. It's why President Obama added additional resources to Afghanistan.
So you're saying it was the general's fault that they didn't ask for more troops?
No, I'm saying that the United States had what at the time the military felt was an appropriate level of resources, and in retrospect, everybody now, I suspect, says we wish we would have been doing more, because the enemy, particularly as Iraq got better, the jihadists and al-Qaeda needed a place to go. They went to the Horn of Africa, and they went to Pakistan and began to revitalize the efforts to attack Afghanistan. And as that grew, additional resources were sent by both this administration and the previous administration to Afghanistan. But in retrospect, I think a lot of military experts say we wish that we would have been doing more, but that wasn't what was going on at the time.
I cannot let you go without a comment on one other news story of the morning. Do you think it was fair, right, a grave injustice that Rush Limbaugh was dropped from the bid for the Rams?
Well, look, this is a very, buying a professional football team or any kind of professional sports team is a very odd enterprise, because the players have a big role in affecting the attitudes of the owners, and the owners have absolute approval to decide whether or not they're going to allow you to buy a competing team. And I thought it was a very powerful signal when significant leaders in the players' union and then significant owners made it clear that they were against Rush Limbaugh being part of the effort to take over the Rams. I think it's unfortunate. I think it was unfair. But it's frankly the sort of hardball politics that gets played in sports, which is sort of odd, isn't it? It's politics in sports.
All right. Karl Rove, thanks so much for being with us.